Hi, welcome to another episode. In this video, I'm going to go over how to use a 35mm film SLR camera. I'm not going to go into any advanced features or techniques, but just kind of a really basic overview if you've never used a 35mm film camera before and you want to get one and get started shooting some film photography with a SLR camera. All right, so what I have here is an Olympus OM-1, and I'm gonna use this camera to show you how a standard 35mm film SLR camera works, kind of the functions, how to load it. And once we cover that, at the end of this video, I'll have a slideshow with some images I've created using this camera. So with that said and done, let's just go right into how this camera works and how most standard 35mm SLR cameras work as well. So one thing that's good about this camera is it's a full metal body. It's really solid and it's hard to break it. This is like a 50-year-old camera, and it still has a lot of life left in it. Now when it comes to a quality of an image shooting film, it really comes down to the lens and the glass to create a sharp, crisp, and high quality film image. So let's look at how it works. So this is your winding spool lever here, and you lift this up and it will pop the back open. And again, all these features are super standard on most 35mm film SLR cameras. So then when you have your film roll, you put it in here and you pull the films across, and 35mm film will have little holes on the edges, and you want to put those little openings on these pegs here. You can see this wheel, and then right here you see these little slits, and you just want to push the end of the film into one of those slits and then progress it to the next slide like this. And when you pull this lever, it'll wind the film and wrap it, and that'll secure it. So once it's wound and you see it pulling through, you know it's good to go. Then you close this, and when you close it, it's on the S, start. So then you just want to wind it and progress it a few times, usually 3 times, until you're on number 1. And now you're ready to go on your first slide. Now I don't use batteries on this camera, but it does have an internal light meter, and a ton of 35mm film cameras will have a light meter. So in that case, you want to make sure you change the ISO setting here, so it tells the camera which ISO of film you're using. So in this case, if I were using, say, Portra 400, I would push this little button down right here and turn this wheel to 400. That tells the light meter that it can read light, assuming that the film is a 400 ISO. So pretty much every camera will have something like this. It might be in a different location, but that's pretty much it. And then you control your aperture opening on the lens. This has f4 to f22, and your shutter speed from bulb to 1 second, 2 seconds, up to 1/1000th of a second, which is pretty fast. So yeah, and then you just control your zoom. Now, because this is an SLR, when you look through the viewfinder, that's where you'll see your light meter is inside the viewfinder. That's also pretty standard on most cameras. And depending on how it reads the light, you'll see a little line that tells you it's underexposed or overexposed, and then it'll show you when you're properly exposed. Now, because I don't use the light meter with this camera, I usually just use the Sunny 16 rule, which is where you set your aperture to 16, and then you set your shutter speed to be equal to your ISO. Now, in most cases, your ISO doesn't perfectly match your shutter speed. For example, if I were shooting Portra 400, I don't have a shutter speed of 1/400th of a second. So the closest one is 1/500th of a second. But with the Sunny 16 rule, I always overexpose slightly, either 1 stop or a little bit less. So if I were using Portra 400 and I was outside and it was a clear sunny day, I would put it on f16, and then I would put it on 1/250th of a second. 250 is my shutter, so it'd be slightly overexposed, but not too much. And then if you get into shade or it's darker, I just adjust from there, and I kind of guess, and I just open up my aperture a bit to 11 or f8. You can also change it if you want to, if you're going off the Sunny 16 rule and you want to get more shallow depth of field and open up your aperture a bit, you can just move it one, stop, move your aperture one stop up as well. So as you open your aperture, you can just increase your shutter speed. So I can do f11 at 500 or f8 at 1/1000th of a second, and that is the same exposure as 250 at f16. So you can just adjust from there basically. And if you're in shade, then you move it 2 stops. And if it gets darker, you can just go, if you're inside, that's when it becomes tricky, because without a good light source, you need to have a lot of light oftentimes. And I've just shot so much now, manually adjusting my exposure settings, that I kind of have a good sense of that. So when I'm inside and in low light, I open up my aperture all the way, and I usually put it on f60, or sorry, open up my aperture all the way, whatever the lens, in this case f4, and then I put my shutter speed on 60, 1/60th of a second. And then shooting handheld, and I try to hold it really still. And then if it's really dark, I'll go to 1/30th of a second. But once you're past slower, once you make your shutter speed slower than 1/60th and you're shooting handheld, you'll start getting some movement in your shot just from pushing the camera, and it's a little bit too slow for a handheld shot, but you can still get some cool images. And if it's really dark, you can even go to 1/15th of a second. Your images will have some motion blur and some shakiness, so they won't have sharp lines around your subjects, but that could be a style choice as well if you want to go for that. And I think that's totally cool. Like if it's really low light, I'm inside maybe at a party and I want to take some handheld candid shots, I'll open up my aperture all the way and I'll shoot at 1/15th of a second with the ISO 400 or even 800 film. I get enough light to create an exposure on my film, but I'll get some motion blur, but I'm okay with that because I still kind of capture the moment, and that little bit of motion kind of adds a style to that. So just be aware, once you go slower than 1/60th of a second and you're shooting handheld, you run the risk of getting some movement in your shot just from holding it handheld. So that's pretty much a quick overview of this camera, the Olympus MD, and how 35mm film cameras work. Also, most cameras come with a shutter release input right here. So if you have a shutter release cable, you can put it in right here, and then you can put it on a tripod. You have a tripod mount here, and you can use your shutter cable, release cable, to take exposure as well and fire the shutter. So yeah, that's pretty much it. You either use the internal light meter, or if your camera's light meter is broken, you can go with the Sunny 16 rule and just get some practice with it. One thing I like about shooting film is oftentimes I make sure my shots are perfect. I control everything from the exposure, my aperture, and my shutter speed to create the exact image I want, and I know exactly what I get. Everything is controlled. But oftentimes, especially with 35mm cameras, when I'm I'm on a road trip or traveling or hanging out with people and I just want to like capture some moments, then I just kind of use my instinct from my experience shooting film. I use the Sunny 16 rule, and I take a more candid approach, and I don't worry too much about getting just the perfect image. I don't think too much about creating the exact image I want. I kind of just play around with it, have fun. You get 36 exposures per 35mm film roll, which for me is a lot. I'm used to shooting my Hasselblad medium format camera where I only get 12 shots. So when I shoot 35mm, and this is my personal preference, I'd like to just take more of a candid shots. I don't pay as much attention, but when I use my medium format Hasselblad, I only have 12 exposures, and I always, put a lot of thought and a lot of effort into creating the image I want with that particular camera. So I kind of change around between different films sizes, from 35mm, medium format, even large format, and different cameras, and then I have different experiences for each one. I have another little camera I use to get some candid shots as well. That's, you know, just out and about, and it's just a little bit more fun to capture moments, and maybe that's what you're into. But then I use my medium format camera to, when I'm out taking landscape photography, and I set it up on a tripod, and I am more thoughtful about the images I create. So that's kind of the way I do it. I also use this camera for some candid on-the-go shots, and yeah, it's a really solid camera. So now that we've reviewed that, hopefully you've learned how a 35mm works a bit, how you can load it. Yeah, it also has a timer right here. If you put that down, you wind it, and then you just fire the shutter. Oh no, let's see, how does it work? Oh, right here. You push that, it's a 10-second timer, and then it fires when it gets to the top. Just like that. Another quick tip is, once you are done, once you get to frame 36, don't wind this lever again past 36, because it could pull the film out of your roll and you won't be able to wind it back up. So one thing, when I first used 35mm cameras, I actually had some trouble with the film loading it because it works differently than I'm used to with medium format cameras. So a little tip is, once you wind it and you shoot and you get to 36, I actually don't even wind it after 35 because I don't want to like pull the film out. And then there's a release button. Usually sometimes they're on the bottom of the camera. In this case, it's right here, this little R. You just turn this to release, and that will allow you to rewind your film and wind it back the opposite direction. So this lever winds your film from left to right, and it progresses each exposure. And then when you're done with your roll, you hit the release button or switch to R, whatever the case may be. And then you use this little winding spool here, follow the arrow, and you wind, and you keep winding it. And when you do this, it takes the film from this roll and it winds it back into its film cartridge. And then once you feel a little tug, you pull it, and that usually is the feeling when you feel a little tug, that's the film coming out of this little slot here. And then you can wind it if you want. You can wind it all the way back up, but if you're developing your own film, you don't want to wind the film all the way into the cartridge, because then you have to go into a dark room, pop it off, and pull the film out. So once you feel that little tug, pull it a little bit more to release it, and then your film will usually end up right here in the middle. That way you have the end of it and you can pull it out for development. So that's just a little tip there. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's your intro to 35mm film cameras. Super quick, basic kind of overview, just in case you've never used 35mm film SLRs before and you want to try it out. Hopefully this video helps you know how a camera works and helps you get out and start shooting. So now that we've gone over how 35mm SLRs work, you know, make sure you set if you're using the internal light meter and it works, make sure you set your assumed ISO correctly here, and you have your exposure. You wind it, you use this lever to progress to the next exposure, the next slide. And then once you're done, you hit the release button or switch it to R, and you wind it until you feel a little tug, wind it a little bit more, and then you're good to open it, take your film out, and get it developed. So now I want to kind of talk about my thoughts and impressions of this camera. This camera specifically I think is super cool. For one, it's a full metal solid body, even though it has some wear here over the edges on the black paint that's worn off. It's still like solid camera in great condition. One thing that's cool about this camera is it actually has removable lens, which is most people are used to, and that's common. Most SLRs though have removable lenses so that you can switch them out. This one is a 35 to 70 zoom lens, which is a really good standard lens. You can do a little bit of a wide angle at 35mm, a normal view at 50, and then a little bit of a telephoto at 70. So yeah, it's a really nice camera. It's a nice lens, super solid, like it's still working today. So there you go. If you have this camera, one like it, you know, they're super great. Even though the light meter doesn't work, I still use it. I just use the Sunny 16 rule and kind of guess on the exposures, but I've never been disappointed on any of the images I've made. So now that we've covered all of that, let's go ahead and roll the slideshow of some images I created using this Olympus 35mm SLR camera, and thanks for watching.